All right, everybody. Hello. Today we have a very special guest, someone whose YouTube channel I've been watching for years now. We've invited Dr. Mark Peterson from the Frog Outside the Well Research Center, and he has so graciously taken some time in this morning for me, evening for him, to chat about a lot of stuff, important stuff, I think, for our community and for everybody learning Korean and joining into the movement that is Korean culture as time goes on. So if for some strange reason you're not familiar with who Dr. Peterson is, I've written down some of his credentials here for you. So Mark Peterson is an associate professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. He has a PhD in East Asian languages and civilization from Harvard University and an extensive history of scholarship on Korean society through, I've seen newspaper articles that you've written, all kinds of different, reports and papers and things like that that are fascinating. But his current body of work you can find almost weekly, I think, on his YouTube channel, The Frog Outside the Well, 우물 밖의 개구리. Lots of really great discussions, lots of positivity about Korean history, which those two words are hard to put in the same sentence sometimes, but the work that you're doing for promoting and changing the direction of Korean history is very meaningful. So I'm very glad to have some time to chat with you today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So the first question that I have for you, I wrote down here. So could you just share an overview of your journey with the Korean language? How intertwined is that with your history of scholarship and travel to Korea and things like that?
Well, it's different phases. My first phase was as a Mormon missionary. And you might ask what textbook we used. We didn't have a textbook. There were no textbooks. In 1965, there were no textbooks on Korean language. There were a couple of phrase books that we used, and we had dialogues about a church that we memorized. And then we talked to people. So it was a very natural language learning situation because we were in Korea, living in Korea, working with Korean people, and learning every day from what people would say. And then after the mission experience, it was 2.5 years from 65 to 68. I went to college and then studied Korean academically and studied some Chinese for the sake of Korean history. And some Japanese, because if you're going to do a PhD, it turns out you have to have both Chinese and Japanese in your repertoire. And then I lived in Korea a total of 15 years, and I'm constantly learning the language. I don't consider myself a perfect speaker of Korean, but I get by.
That's actually something I wanted to talk about with you, because something I promote on this YouTube channel that I'm running is that authenticity is more important than a high level of technical proficiency or fluency or whatever. These terms are all kind of hard to define, but I've noticed that you have a really interesting Korean language experience as a speaker. When a lot of people learn Korean and get themselves to at least an intermediate level where they're able to have some conversations with native speakers and things like that, they get very discouraged by the fact that oftentimes, I think, to native speakers of Korean, a foreigner speaking the language is kind of like a sideshow, kind of a funny, interesting, wow, that's so weird. Why is this person who doesn't, look like a Korean person speaking this language? I've noticed though, and often the response that they'll get is something like, wow, 한국말 잘하시네요, or something like that. You're so good at Korean. I've made a joke before. I'm worried sometimes if I were to get into a car accident or something here in Korea and need an ambulance, I would scream out for help, and the people on the side of the street might say, "와, 한국말 진짜 잘하신다," or something like that. They would say, "Well, he's so good at Korean," while I'm asking for medical attention. Yet when I look at the comment section on your very popular YouTube videos, you get tons of engagement from people who are interested in what you're talking about. You don't get those kinds of comments. It seems like a lot of the comments that you get are thoughtful questions that they would ask to a scholar who was also Korean like them. And I think that the reason for that is because you encapsulate a lot of this concept of authenticity that I've been talking about. You're confidently talking about things, whether or not it's in perfect grammar or whatever, and you're conveying meaning. And I'm curious about, how it seems like you had a long time, learning the language through exposure and then study. So a very similar journey to a native speaker in a lot of ways.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's true. I think one secret to learning language is you cannot be afraid to make mistakes. If you're afraid to make a mistake, it slows you down. And eventually people quit because they can't speak without making mistakes. So I make a lot of mistakes and I don't care because I learn from that. And it's not that I want to make more mistakes. I say I don't care, meaning I don't care if I make mistakes because it's from the mistakes that I learn. When I say something to a small group and I get a bad reaction, I know I've said something wrong and I'll ask about it. Right. But that doesn't keep me from making more attempts to learn the language. For example, I'll tell you a funny story. I like to learn Chinese characters. And I was looking in the Okpian, the Chinese character dictionary, and I noticed that the definition for yoja, the Chinese character for yoja, was called the Keji yoja. Well, I thought the Chinese has upper registers of language. Keji, I looked it up as a word for woman. Yeah, a woman character. And so Keji must be a high class word for woman. So the next chance I had, I was talking to some of my staff. This is when I was the director of the Fulbright program, talking to 3 or 4 women. And I said, I used the word Keji in a sentence, or something. And the response was horrific. And I said, oh, what did I say? And they said, you don't use that word for a woman. It's a very low-class pejorative kind of word. Yeah. Well, I'd never run into it before. I thought it was particularly high class, not particularly low class. But I will tell you, I'll never forget the meaning of Keji because of the way that I learned it. And so learning in this method is painful sometimes, but that's the way I learn, and I've got no alternative but to keep learning that way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I've made similar mistakes. When I was a teacher, I had a problem where I was letting parents know that the 성적표 had come out, your grades sheet, but I didn't know that there was a difference in pronunciation between 성적 and 성적. And so, 성적 means sexual, like related to your sex. And so I called parents and said, the 성적표 has come out, and they said, 선생님, no. And I was like, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I've run into that too. No pain, no gain, right? So do you think you learned more Korean while on the streets here as a missionary, or did you learn more Korean in the classroom?
Starting off as a missionary, definitely. Because I was constantly in my books as well. I was constantly listening to what people would say and taking notes on what people would say and looking up those words. So my foundation from that first 2.5 years was pretty solid. But thereafter, reading literature is really one of the best ways to learn Korean. I say literature, thinking of short stories that I started reading, but also nonfiction literature, reading academic work, historical work. So, there are 4 phases of language. There's speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And my speaking and listening, I can get by fairly well. My reading skills are okay, but my writing skills are very, very poor because my Korean language education did not involve very much writing. It's all been oral and reading. And so my writing skills are very, very poor. So when I sometimes write my own subtitles for my YouTubes, and I'll get comments from people. They'll say, oh, you make a lot of mistakes on your subtitles. I've decided it's okay because it's imperfect like I'm imperfect. And when people look at it, they'll comment sometimes, but I think they comment less and less now. So they're putting up with it. There's an arcane word that I use sometimes in the classroom, and the word is Argot. And people don't use the word very often, but Argot means your corpus of language, the language you know, the words you know.
Yeah.
And your Argot is defined by what you do. And I do history, I do literature. I don't do science. I was called upon one time to be an expert witness in a trial. And the trial was over malpractice of a product. What do you call it? When a product harms people. And one of the things they did in the suit was they cited a Korean research project that had been translated into English. And my job was to critique the English translation and say whether it was an accurate translation. Well, it was medical terminology. It was very, very difficult. And I told them on the stand, you know, you swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth. And I said, these are medical terms that I'm not familiar with, but in looking them up and in, you know, I can say that it was a, you know, a very precise kind of translation. I don't have that science Argot.
Okay, let's move on to another question here. So this one's a little bit more in your wheelhouse as a scholar of Korean society. So like you've spoken about before, Korean is definitely a world language. It's not only useful to learn, but it's very important. In my opinion, the whirlwind of tragedies that occurred in Korea during the early 20th century, the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, drew some pretty rigid lines about who's Korean, who's invited, who gets to be Korean. And my understanding is that those lines are pretty much a visual thing. It's a blood thing. It's an ethnic thing. These ideas like 민족주의 and, you know, 일민주의, Ilmanism, the 이승만's, you know, ideas around developing a state. These ideas that the nation is the people and the people is the nation are probably pretty scary to Americans who learn about what happened in Europe in the 20th century as well. So the inability to fit in as another member of the Korean world leads a lot of people to get discouraged and quit. I think this is maybe the root cause. It's not necessarily how difficult the language is or anything like that. It's kind of like there's not a seat at the table for people who aren't ethnically Korean. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I think that's how it feels to a lot of people. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as someone who was here during the earlier stages of the current state that exists in South Korea. Was it like this then too?
I think it was not as big a problem when I was learning because there were very few learners of Korean back in my day. We were extremely rare, such that we always got this, oh, you speak Korean well. You know, you could just barely get started and you get all these affirmations. So I know what you're talking about. There's sort of ethnic exclusion that you find in Korea, but I found the opposite. I found an extreme ethnic inclusion, a welcoming and a reaffirming the fact that you're trying to learn Korean. People would reaffirm it all the time by saying, oh, you speak Korean well. And then the strange thing is, as time goes by, you really speak Korean well when people stop telling you speak
exactly.
Korean well.
Yeah. When they start fixing it, they're saying, no, you're wrong. That's proof you're good, right?
Yeah. So on my YouTube channel, it's kind of funny. Every now and again, I'll find a comment of someone who said, oh, I just discovered your channel. You speak Korean well. I was surprised that you speak Korean well. Well, a newcomer will say that, but you know, my regular viewers don't say that. They sort of expect me to speak Korean to some degree. They know I don't speak Korean perfectly, but they expect me to speak Korean to the degree that I can.
So when you were first trotting on Korean soil, when you were joining into the Korean culture as a resident of this peninsula, what kinds of things did you do to fit in more? Because you know, as a high level speaker of this language, there's a lot more than just being able to conjugate verbs or pull on vocabulary words. There's a whole persona you have to adopt in order to really, you know, speak the language authentically. What kinds of things did you do to fit in?
I never worried about that. I knew I was a foreigner, and Well, I have to correct that a little bit because for most of my career, I really wanted to fit in. And I wanted to fit in, not so much in language, but in my historical perceptions of Korea. Because when I first started out, I said a couple of things about Korean history that seemed to me correct. And I got jumped on because it wasn't the orthodox point of view.
Yeah.
And as time went by, I wanted to do Korean history in the Korean history way. But as time went by, I felt more and more uncomfortable about it because there's a certain myth that you have to buy into. And I got tired of buying into that myth. And rather, I thought I should tell Korea the way I see it. I should talk about Korean history the way I have read it and the way I have understood it. So that's why I started the Frog Outside the Well. I've said, hey, I'm not one of the frogs. I'm not one of you. And I'm happy with that. Before, I used to be unhappy with it. I wanted to be one of the frogs in the well. I wanted to belong. I wanted to have orthodox points of view about history with maybe a different view here and there. But now I'm saying, no, I'm a completely frog outside the well. I'm a complete outsider, and I'm happy with that. So it's a very interesting question you ask because yes, to learn the language, to feel part of the language, to internalize the language, you want to be part of the in-group. But I've passed that. I've been in the in-group, and now I want to be in the out-group. I'm the frog outside the well. So that's what it's come to for me. Hey, you were going to ask about hanja.
That was the other thing I wanted to talk about was hanja. Yeah. Your history with hanja.
Let me talk about that because I think hanja is very important to learning Korea in a deeper sort of way. Now, having said this, I'm the first to recognize that my Korean language ability is heavy on the Sino-Korean words, but it's light on pure Korean words. And my study, my history research, the fact that I studied classical Chinese all lends itself to more of the hanja approach to Korean. And I think it's valid. I think it's very important. And I think the more hanja you learn, the better Korean speaker you're going to be. There's a expression you see in folk literature, in the story of Hong Gil-dong and several other folk stories, where the story will start off with the high minister, and then it's always a high minister of some kind, and then the child is born, and the child was a jade child, just a pure precious child from the get-go. And when the child was taught something, when you teach him one thing, he would learn 10. Or if you teach him one thing, he would learn 100. You see that phrase in the folk literature. And it's based in the truth that if you learn one Chinese character, you learn 10 words that are connected to it. You learn one, you learn 10. It's a vocabulary building trick that if you learn the one character, you learn how it occurs in several other combinations. And that's a vocabulary building thing. And then by the same token, when somebody says a word you don't understand, but you recognize a Chinese character, you can figure out what it means a little bit from knowing associated words that have similar characters in it.
Yeah, it's like a spider web of all these interconnected different, if you learn one hanja, you're going to see it pop up in other words where now you see a word you've never seen before and you can guess based on the context. Okay, I think I know what this word means. Something go ahead.
You said the word spider web. A good friend of mine who's very, very good at Korean uses the word nexus. And his master's degree was on the nexus of learning. Nexus meaning more than just a network, but this complex network that's like a spider web. So the more connections you have to what a word means, the more chances you're going to have to remember it and internalize it and use it in your own speaking.
So you lived in Korea from when to when? The
65 to 2019.
Okay, all right.
So 15 years over that 50-year period.
So during that period of time, there's been a huge shift in the written language of Korea, where they have essentially, in most writing, they have stopped using the actual hanja. So what we were just talking about linguistically, we would call those hanjaol, where you learn a Korean word based on a Chinese character. Hanja, the actual characters, written in the Chinese style, have largely gone out of fashion for political reasons and also like literacy reasons for the population. However, I advocate for still learning as many of the characters as you can, because a lot of Korean people still know them, even though they don't necessarily learn them in school. What's been your experience watching those kind of disappear over your time interacting with the language, like in newspaper articles?
I've been sad to see hanja disappear. I gave a presentation one time, and this group of hanja, pro hanja people, asked me to serve on their committee, and I am on the committee of the hanja hakwe in Korea. We haven't done much for a while. They put out a magazine, but I wanted to point out this book here. This book is a translation of my dissertation, and you see the title is in hanja,
right?
And the book was produced by Ilchogak. It's a very prestigious publishing house. And a year or so after the book came out, this was like 97, and in 98 or so, I stopped by to see them and see how the book was doing. And they said, "Oh, it's selling well, and we're looking at maybe a second edition and such." And then they said, "By the way, you might be interested in knowing that your book was the last book that we published with Chinese on the cover."
Wow.
So in a sense, I was happy to be a part of history. In a sense, I was sad that my book was the last to have hanja on the cover, which is to say that before that time, the majority of publishers would publish serious academic texts with hanja on the cover. But in the meantime, hanja had already lost its place within the text. The earliest texts that I studied, older books from the 50s and 60s and such that I'd studied, the hanja was just sprinkled in.
Right.
Later, the hanja was put in parentheses for clarification, and the driving text was hangul.
Right.
And with that kind of text, you still had the cover in hanja. Now, the last book was cover in hanja. And of course, the text, only a few words that really need clarification, you put in hanja in most texts these days. So I'm sad to see that happen, because I think we've lost literacy in the process. Literacy means what? To be able to read and write and to do things, and to give up the Chinese portion of that literacy, I think is unfortunate, because we lose a lot of etymology, we lose a lot of nexus to learn other words through the learning of hanja. The younger generation is better at English, but they're worse at Korean.
Yeah, I've said that to some people too. Is the hanja didn't necessarily go away. That seat, that place in the language still exists, but it's being replaced with the Latin alphabet. You'll see, on signage and things like that, certain words will be written in English instead of, or not English, but in Youngmun, the Western alphabet, and not in Chinese characters. So I think there will always be a place in the Korean language for foreign clarification text,
Well, I think a foreigner is smart to learn as much hanja as etymology as they can in the words that they're learning.
So speaking of you going down in history for your book there, the last book from that publishing house with hanja on the cover, I definitely think you're going to go down in Korean history as a wonderful scholar and promoter of the culture. So as a fan of Korean culture and a hopeful participant in it for the rest of my life, thank you for your wonderful work. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've indeed been gratified to see the wonderful support I get from my YouTube channel. Koreans really appreciate their culture being portrayed in a positive light. And I didn't set out to portray it in a positive light. It's just that's the way I see it. This song and dance that I do all the time about Korean history is peaceful and stable. I didn't go out to say, "Hey, Korea, there's a better way to look at your history." I just looked at history and said, "Hey, Korea says this is a war-torn, chaotic history, but that's not the way I see it." And so I've been calling it the way I see it.
Well, thank you for calling it the way you see it, because I think it's encouraging to me. It's encouraging, hopefully, to a lot of Korean people, and I think you're really contributing positively to this cultural momentum that Korea has. So,
well, thank you, Ian, and best luck to you in your work in Korea too. I appreciate you calling on me, and I wish you the best as you go forward.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll talk again soon. I'm sure we got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we can talk again. Yes, thank you.
All right, take care.
See you. Bye.
Hey, just wanted to check in with everybody following the launch of the beta test for our Satori Pechi online course. We sold out all 10 spots in like 2 hours. That's not what I was expecting, but thank you very much for your support. If you want to be a part of future tests or the full release of the Satori Pechi course that we've been working on, go ahead and join our mailing list at koreanpatch.co, and you'll get all of the latest updates right away. Thank you again for your support, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.